And today we're going to be talking about the life sciences sector, and specifically we're going to be talking about whether it's a watershed moment for the UK life sciences policy, how broken is it, and do we need to fix it? So hopefully that's contentious enough for people to have some good views and good questions to ask our panel. I'm Emma Palmer-Foster. I'm the chair for today's debate. I've been working in the UK pharma and biotech sector for almost 30 years now, so have some perspective to bring to the question. I'm also a part-time PhD candidate at the Birkbeck, University of London, so I'm very pleased to be chairing this session. And we are really lucky today to be joined by a really interesting panel of people who've all got really interesting things to say about what their organisations did during the pandemic and what they've learned from those changes, what happened at their organisations, and how they think we should adopt new practices going forward. So we're extremely lucky. I know from the preparation there's a lot of very interesting views to be had, so I'm looking forward very much to the debate. Joining me are Clive Dix, who's the CEO of C4X Discovery, Alex Sheppard, who's the co-founder and CEO of Vatic Health, and Deborah Spencer, who's in charge of industrial partnerships at the University of Oxford. And as I said, it's fair to say they've all got really interesting views about what we need to carry forward in terms of life sciences policy and what they learned from the pandemic. How we're going to run this session: after my opening comments, we're going to have 10 minutes from each of the speakers when they're going to talk about their pandemic experiences and what they learnt, and then we're going to turn the floor over to Q&A and comments. So feel free to keep the comments and questions coming throughout the session via the chat box or via the Q&A, and we will deal with those. One thing that we're very aware of in life sciences is that we're as jargonised as any other sector. So we are going to do our absolute best not to deal you an acronym soup. We're going to be as clear as we possibly can be. But if for any reason you think we are becoming too jargonised and it's impacting your enjoyment or understanding of what we're talking about, then do please indicate via the chat or via one of the hand gestures on the panel. Hopefully only the polite hand gestures will give us an idea of whether we're doing a good job on the jargon front. In terms of practical issues, as Orla said, we're recording. Feel free to put the questions into the chat, and we look forward to discussing the issues with you. So we're going to deal with our panellists in alphabetical order, which means we start with Clive. So I'm very happy to introduce Clive now. Clive is the CEO of C4X Discovery, which is a drug discovery firm. He's also the chair of the on the board rather of the Medicines Discovery Catapult and a company called Centauri Pharmaceuticals. And he's been involved with the Vaccines Task Force in both a deputy chair and interim chair capacity. So Clive's going to tell us about what he's learned during the pandemic, what he's been doing, what needs to be taken forward. During our pre-debate comments, Clive made some interesting comments about institutional memory and the convening effect of organisations like the Bioindustry Association. So hopefully he will touch on some of those. And so 10 minutes now for you, Clive. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma, and hello, everybody. So, as Emma said, I'm Clive Dix. I'm a PhD pharmacologist in training, but I've spent the first half of my career in big pharma, actually running R&D organisations, and then moving on to smaller organisations, and then more recently founding small biotech drug discovery type companies and running them and sending them on to big pharma, back to big pharma. So the pandemic was the first year of the pandemic, which is what I'll talk about, was a very interesting period for me because I am the CEO of a small drug discovery company, 40 people based in Manchester and in London, mainly office-based staff that do a lot of analytical work, so no laboratory work. But I also was co-opted onto the Vaccine Task Force as the deputy chair, so I was sort of doing two jobs at the same time, as well as keeping in touch with the other companies that I'm on the board of. And what did we learn in the companies as opposed to task force to start with? So we learned that people are amazingly resilient to start with. That's the first thing you have to really take your hat off to. we were able to very quickly adapt to working from home and using all of the social media and all the electronic wizardry to actually talk to people, you know, so Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meets, all these things just became things that everybody knew how to use. And at the start of the pandemic, I couldn't even get into most of them, but, you know, everybody now uses them like they're just part of your daily life. So I think one of the learnings was that we don't always need to spend time face to face, but we do need to spend time face to face. And I think that that's forever now. I don't think people will be jumping on planes to actually have meetings to work out how to do things unless you really need to sit with people and go through stuff. So I think that that's changed a lot. One of the downsides of it, of course, is the learning that young people that start off in their career get when they join a company is through the interactions with the other people. And we lost a lot of that, and people, young people, particularly new starters or people that haven't been there very long, they really struggle to really engage with the company and know what to do, because they just need that interaction and that shepherding. So that was interesting times in the company, but everything still went well. And, you know, the investment community stood up actually for a change. They didn't want you to go around the city and sit in rooms to meet them and sit there like they knew everything and you had to go and beg to them to talk. They actually had Zoom meetings and they treated us in the same way as we treated them, and it was all very good. And we actually raised money in that time, and it was quite simple because we didn't have to get on planes and fly around the world, and we didn't have to go and sit in offices in London. We just did it all by Zoom meetings. It was all very efficient. So there was lots of good efficiencies from that. But what also happened, and this really comes on to the vaccine task force really, the science community in the UK, which is what we're really talking about here, the life sciences sector, the whole community pulled together, and they pulled together because we had a common enemy, which was COVID. And so whether you're an academic, an industrial scientist, commercial scientist, or a government body, including bodies that work with the government like the BIA, everybody worked as one. And what we learned was a lot of the foundation work that was done in the UK, which the BIA actually was probably instrumental in, then became a foundation for everything we were doing. And we were able to pull on networks, expertise, knowledge bases that we almost didn't know we had. But they all came out of the woodwork and they all worked together. And that was amazing. But there's a bit of a red flag to it all for me. So it all worked really, really well when we really had to move at pace and when we had to work as one industry, so one body. And the government played its part. Well, I would say the government, the vaccine task force plays its part in pulling it together. And we set about it with a completely different mindset to the way currently the government thinks about the science community and the industrial community. We set about it. We're in a partnership mindset, and that was really interesting. So we were speaking to everyone as equals, whether they be scientists in academic labs, small biotechs, large biotechs, big pharmaceutical companies, and the people in the government were just swept along by the way we did it, and we did it the way we do business. And it worked. And what we saw, though, was that creeping back towards business as usual in government as the task force had done its main work. And that was moribund. It was adversarial. It was, we procure, you tell us what you're going to sell us, and we'll try and get a contract that's as cheap as possible. And of course, they're working on behalf of ministers and therefore the electorate, and they're trying to do things with almost no risk. They don't want to be found out to be wrong. They don't want any risk, and therefore things then start moving very, very slowly. And what you start seeing happening is back to where it was before. And because the UK is absolutely dependent on the health service and on the NHS, they become the body that dictates the way things are done, the way policies are drawn up, the way things are procured. And quite frankly, it's not fit for purpose. And it's moved all the way back there now. So we were on a high, we're on a roll. Okay. The sector in the UK was seen as one of the best in the world. We were seeing investors coming saying, how have you done this? They saw that we managed to do some of the best and fastest clinical trials. We set up assay systems for companies to help them work together. We helped fund companies that were struggling to get their products out and then got some reimbursement on the price. All those things were done before the government could blink, and they didn't know it was happening. Once they realised what we'd done and we put some of the risk into the system in different parts, which they didn't like, they started backtracking from that, and they're going back towards that now. And I think that the lesson learned for me is we have got all the pieces, we can be brilliant, and we can show the world how to do things. We can be fleet of foot, we can make things happen. We have all the right skill bases across the patch to do anything in the life sciences sector. But it gets held back every time because we have so much. The NHS and healthcare system is one of our biggest customers, and they hold everything back. So even the funding that comes from them to help move things along from the government is very much done on a piecemeal, risk-averse basis, whereas that's why then the investors start getting slightly nervous about it all, and they are starting to retreat slightly because they've seen things not look as good as it was during what I call wartime. So for me, the lessons learned were exactly that. It was that we have got everything. It was broken before. It looked like it was being fixed, and it looks like it's going back to being broken again. And that's all I have to say, really.
Thanks, Clive. That's really helpful, really provocative, and hopefully will generate a few questions and points from the audience. We're going to turn now to Alex Sheppard, who's the founder or co-founder and CEO of Vatic Health, which was also very much involved in the response to the pandemic. He's an experienced startup CEO and has come to life sciences via a classics degree. So that's an interesting entrance for a life sciences CEO. As I say, got some very interesting comments about what the company did during the pandemic. In our sort of pre-debate conversations, he talked about quite a lot about the device-trained public, which hopefully he will talk about in his comments now, and also about how we should double down on what we're good at. So happy to hand over to Alex now. Over to you, Alex, 10 minutes on what happened to you during the pandemic.
Oh, thanks so much for the intro, and also thanks, Clive. Really fascinating to hear about that. So firstly, just quickly in terms of me. So yes, I started out with classics at Oxford, and then essentially went into life sciences via consulting for kind of some boutique startups. And actually, I spent a bit of time in the kind of university spin-out space, and I ran a couple of companies there, and then decided that I'd actually built up some quite interesting skills and experience, and I wanted to take the leap and set up my own company, which is not an easy decision to take, but actually just a super fulfilling and exciting one. So I left that world and moved to London, and I joined a program called Entrepreneur First, which is an accelerator program there, where I met my co-founder called Mona, who's sort of got 12 years experience in functionalizing nanoparticles, actually primarily from the pharma world, and around kind of drug discovery and things like that. And then we decided to team up within the device space, where I had been for, well, actually over the last kind of 7 years now, in the space of in vitro diagnostics, which of course over the last 10 years is probably 10x underfunded compared against pharma globally. Very few attractive exits, lots of upset investors, very little value accrued there, and I would say very much underappreciated and unloved. I remember talking to a GP when we were looking at actually deploying respiratory infection related PCR testing in point of care and primary care. I remember him saying, but if I get a negative result, that's a waste of money, isn't it? And I remember saying, well, actually, that's not exactly the point. That's still useful as a screening opportunity. But anyway, I think really this is why I was saying it. I think for me, and in terms of obviously what's gone on broadly with the pandemic, I think that we've seen a sort of generational shift with regard to how we look at, I think actually health data for one, sort of holistically, but I think actually there's some really fascinating things going on behind the surface that I think have just completely ripped apart, I think, a lot of what we might have thought healthcare was going to look like over the next 10 years. And actually, I think possibly move things forward quite a lot in terms of the kind of practices there. So I think then in terms of kind of what we've done at Vatic, in terms of and kind of how we've worked through the kind of pandemic, we actually kind of emerged really only out of our incubation as a company in March 2020. And of course, at this point, we had kind of no money at the time, and lockdown had happened. And we have these really interesting ideas around what we want to do with assay design to try to make, at the time, actually try to make lateral flow tests more sensitive. Initially, actually, we were looking at other kind of protein-based biomarkers, actually not looking at infectious disease at the time at all. And then, of course, we realized that we have no way of accessing lab facilities. We're just thinking, well, how as a business are we going to generate any of the sorts of proof points that we need to try to get our ideas and our vision funded? And this is where we really kind of set off on really a bit of a rocket ship journey. And having not really been in the immunoassay space before, we managed to convince a company that kind of CRO at the time to kind of essentially incubate us a little bit. And so we asked them, look, if we can, borrow some lab, we've got some really wacky ideas about actually now how to turn our ideas into a kind of COVID-19 antigen test. And if you allow us the time and space to do that, we'll raise the money, build the project, hire a team, and crack on. And that's exactly what we did. So within about a month of entering the lab, we filed our patent, which was published last week, which is really exciting, essentially around a completely novel way of identifying actually any virus, because actually the technology we built identifies the COVID-19, well, SARS-CoV-2 virus by impersonating the surface of a human cell. And so it's almost acting through a kind of trapdoor mechanic, which is more common in the field of, say, cybersecurity rather than necessarily an assay design. But essentially that was what we had built, because at the time we felt actually mutation was going to be a really big problem in diagnostics going forward. And a lot of people kind of disagreed with us at the time, particularly eminent Oxford physician did. We kind of said, well, no, actually, we think there will be a lot of mutation in the future. And he was like, no, coronavirus never mutates. It's super slow. All of this has been proved wrong eventually. But I think our view was that actually there could be long-term vulnerabilities to tests that are built early. Actually, a lot of tests that were built at the start of the pandemic were actually based on SARS-CoV-1. And we thought that actually could create a lot of risks longer term, because we originally saw COVID-19 as a permanently endemic virus. This is not something that's really ever going to go away. And I think it's something that we, of course, as you know, we're hearing so often from the government, the learning to live with it is sort of a mantra I'm sure we're all getting tired of. But anyway, so we were in the lab and we kind of approached the science in a really different way. That allowed us to raise funding, build a team, and kind of get to the status we are now, where we have a small laboratory in the Oxford Science Park, and we partnered with one of the largest lateral flow manufacturers in Europe. This technology that was born in kind of May last year has now emerged, and it's a sort of CE marked point of care sort of professional use test as of today, and it's now going into a global clinical trial to extend its usage to become a self-test, very, very similar to the sorts of tests that we've seen distributed by the NHS to our own homes. Ours, a tiny startup competing against multi-billion-dollar corporations, we built our own version of this using completely novel technology, which I think has really interesting strategic significance as a test that could have a more long-term lifespan, but also something that has actually a lot of advantages with increased specificity. Really big challenge in lateral flow testing, especially at the moment, is false positives, something that never was seen as a problem earlier in the pandemic. So largely our priority was we can never afford to miss a positive case. Those priorities are shifting. Disease prevalence, generally speaking, is trending downwards, despite, of course, some of the scares that we're seeing in terms of storm clouds on the east. But I think, generally speaking, we are looking at a world in which this is going to come around every year. And I think actually our behaviour to testing has really changed. I mean, I think just kind of then looking at the industry, I think testing
it's a really interesting space. In the UK, it used to be pretty terrible, actually. You know, for example, flu screening is just not even really a market in the UK. It's actually a multi-billion-dollar market in the US, and that's largely because of Tamiflu, and there being a lot of clinician-based incentives to prescribe that, but you really don't prescribe it unless you've got a positive test. And as a result, it created a market around that. And now, interestingly, of course, with the kind of government approach to testing, we've seen, of course, the government essentially create a monopsony around testing with a view to control the market, ensure open access. This has created enormous benefits and accessibility around testing. And I think it's also probably changed what consumers are going to, well, and patients are going to come to expect from healthcare services. We now come to expect data. We come to expect easy access and expecting to do it immediately, not, you know, waiting 2 weeks to get an appointment, as we're seeing at the moment, and then not actually passing muster to be worthy of a test. I think a lot of those practices are going to be challenged, and it's not just within respiratory disease. I think it's across the board. But essentially, in terms of our involvement in the pandemic, we joined the government task force that was originally called Operation Moonshot. Fantastic opportunity for us as a company that had only been in lateral flow for about 12 months to suddenly be elevated to some of the most preeminent experts in the country, which was, of course, fantastic, but also we were able to contribute quite significantly. I mean, there was a time essentially where the government strategy was we need to get a British-made test. We need to onshore capacity. Supply chain risks have not gone away, and they are a permanent fixture, a semi-permanent fixture at the moment, where even cardboard is hard to come by. And at the time, government strategy was essentially that, well, we can't ship things in like we did with PPE. Look what went wrong. Essentially, you know, where we had those last-minute orders from Turkey that were on the tarmac, and it was all just really embarrassing. We've also seen a lot of the sort of democracy claims around, especially around PPE, where it was such a panic. You know, we're literally talking about clinicians about to perform surgery with a bib on, you know, properly, really rough things happening, that it became really awful. And that's why with testing, they'd kind of seen that, and Moonshot was really around trying to avoid that kind of crisis, and so they really wanted a UK-based test. Of course, that didn't happen. Essentially, as governments will do, they prioritize what they can get the cheapest and that will absolutely scale, and they can have utter confidence in its scaling. The UK industry later, and also given a lot of the sensitivities around that, I think that does create, I think from a defence or biosecurity perspective, as we've seen with COVID, I think it does create enormous risks if the country can't build its own security of supply for such critical things like this. I think it does put us in a really sticky situation, as we did have at the start of the pandemic with PPE, but then also came into play with testing. I mean, thankfully, we were able to procure tests in enormous quantities. Of course, endless debate over the quality of said tests, and I think, you know, actually, you know, a lot of lateral flow testing getting tarred with the brush of a single product that, of course, was approved really fast and actually, you know, wasn't the government choice at all. I thought it could get. They were looking to get a much more famous brands and have now gone on to be a much better performing products within the lab. Government wanted tests in, you know, hundreds of millions, you know, really spending, you know, multi-billion-pound contracts on that, because they wanted to serve the entire population, and that was their goal. And they found that actually UK industry couldn't really scale to meet that. One, in terms of, you know, the access to tests that could immediately be scaled like that, and two, around the number of factories that could do it. So that stuff is ongoing. I know there is work currently going on with the government to look at that, because it is still a priority area to ensure that diagnostics is an area that we aren't short on. But I think it's interesting how that's kind of played out in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the big winners there. Largely the winners that have been picked are external to the UK, and we've seen, you know, Innova, for example, the biggest winner of all, you know, spending most of their money on Gulfstream jets and holiday homes in South California, which is brilliant, but doesn't exactly contribute a huge amount to our local industry.
And so from our perspective as a company, of course, you know, we want to do as much as we possibly can to support the UK market, and we are currently engaged with the Department of Health on that. But I think actually from a lot of the market dynamics around this, and we are seeing, you know, actually a lot more, you know, kind of market demand actually in other countries as a result of, you know, kind of public policy here in the UK. So I think definitely, I think last thing before I finish is I think actually the UK in life science, I look at the UK and Europe in life science a little bit like how Silicon Valley was fixed in tech about 20 years ago. We actually have a ridiculous density of talent and capability within this sector. And I would also say over the last 10 years, from a talent perspective, we have seen almost the branding around small pharma and tech companies and device companies completely shift. You know, people who originally 10 years ago would have spent an entire career at Novartis, J&J, these days are done. They are completely over. I think we're now going to see the best talent around in the world moving into Europe, because actually in life science, I would say, because there are some of the best capabilities around here, but also significantly these people will not just be hoovered up by the largest companies in the world, because I think people are now alive to the fact that there is much more opportunity, I think, in the startup space than there was before. And I think we're in a really interesting position. Key weakness that we have still compared against the US is really around scale-up funding. I think you've seen, I think this was applied a little bit by Clive before, seed funding. Even pre-seed is competitive for investors now. It's crazy. Someone trying to cash a 100k check into a startup company, probably with literally zero traction, that is a competitive space.
Alex has frozen on my screen. Sorry, Alex, have you finished your comment? Sorry to interrupt.
He's frozen on mine too.
Oh, okay.
Mine too.
Okay. Well, let me take that juncture to thank you for another dose of contention, which is always great, and we can move on now to Dr. Deborah Spencer from the University of Oxford. She works there on innovation and business partnerships, and she's going to tell us all about her experiences during the pandemic, working on the vaccine, etc. So over to you, Deborah. Looking forward to your comments.
Thanks a lot, Emma. I hope that you can see my slides now. I don't know.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay, that's great. I'm doing the visuals, the visual bit. The other two speakers didn't, so I thought maybe some nice visuals would be quite good. So I'm going to just run through what I'm going to be speaking about. So I'm going to talk about who I am and what I do at the University of Oxford, the innovation and the life sciences vision, and the Oxford vaccine. I'm sure you're interested in that, and our work beyond the vaccine, and what's happening within the university now. So first of all, who am I? And I thank you, Emma, for the introduction to me. And I just wanted to say that other than universities, I've worked as a consultant. I've also worked in a clinical trials company and ran a life sciences intermediary. And while I was at Edinburgh University, I actually helped to create and roll out a genomics centre. So that's kind of a bit more of the background. So what do I do in the University of Oxford? I work in a dedicated business development team, and we this is a really important part of it, and you'll see when I come and talk about some of the interaction, one of the case studies actually about the vaccine. So, we're a contact point for business interactions. We proactively engage with industry to increase our levels of industry academic engagement. And the aim of the teams right across the university, because there's quite large teams, is to develop these long-term strategic relationships. And you can see some of these strategic relationships that we've got with different organisations on this slide. But I also have a different role, and that role is to lead on the UK industrial strategy. And I joined the university in July 2018, and the industrial strategy was rolled out in November 2017. So quite soon after it was launched, I joined the university to do this. And now, since the summer, the industrial strategy is being superseded by the innovation strategy. So it's very similar to the industrial strategy, and it centres around research and business working together, focusing on areas of strength. We want to address the economic and societal challenges of our time. And the innovation focuses on the broad areas that the government sees, where the government sees opportunities to accelerate the economy and where they are allocating funding. So this is just a snippet from the life sciences vision that I've got here. So it's the life sciences vision is being developed by government, NHS England, industry, academia, and the medical research charities with the common goal of creating the right conditions for industry, academia, and the NHS to work together. And so what they want to try and achieve is they've got an ambition to be a science superpower. We haven't heard that one today. Achieving investment of the 2.4 of the GDP by 2027, which was always the objective. It's not just for the life sciences sector, just to say. We want high quality health data. Well, one of the drivers is high quality health data, which is an important feature of the NHS in the UK. And access to finance, which I think Alex was alluding to with his company as well, and ease of doing business and are big attractors to starting up companies. So Emma had asked me to talk about my experience of working on during the pandemic, and I told her a story about what we had done with Brazil, but I just wanted to say about the vaccine. So it was, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It took a lot of effort, and working within this huge organisation that is the University of Oxford, that's decentralised, was not an easy job, and every part of the university was focused on developing the vaccine at pace, and even that included the social sciences. And at one point in 2020, there were 155 different COVID projects being pursued across the university. So I just wanted to say that. So my story actually kicks off in April 2020. When I received an urgent email from somebody I'd worked with in the Department of International Trade based in Sao Paulo, and he said, "This is not a joke, we really need your help." And I had hosted a Brazilian mission on a vaccine mission, really unbelievably, in September the year before, in 2019. And we had companies there from Brazil. I invited academics and companies from the local Oxfordshire ecosystem. And so we all got together. I knew what they were doing, what their capabilities were. And then so in April, I got this call. I realised it was serious. And at that time, I then contacted people like John Bell, Adrian Hill from the Jenner Institute, and some of the others that were Andrew Pollard, who was involved in the manufacturing side, and just to let them know that this was something of importance. And they didn't dismiss me at all. They said, "Wow, fantastic, it's just what we need," because we were in the middle of lockdown, and the infection rates were actually not increasing because we were all isolating. And so we needed to do trials for this vaccine. So what we did was, so they took over from then, and they basically contacted the Brazilian AstraZeneca, I think after I spoke to them, 2 days after AstraZeneca became the partner for the vaccine. So it was all very timely. And so they contacted the Brazilians, and they recruited I think it was 100,000 extra people for the clinical trials to help accelerate this whole process of the vaccine. So it was a great success, basically. And on the 1st of November, we announced that we, along with the Brazilian Ministry of Health, we're going to set up a global health and clinical research unit based in Sao Paulo in Brazil. The unit will be the first of its kind that Oxford has developed in the Americas. Will work on developing new drugs and vaccines to drive ongoing human health research. It will also focus on training new generations of clinical researchers by offering master's and PhD studentships and courses on infectious diseases and clinical and vaccinology. The unit is a culmination of strong relationship that the university has built throughout the pandemic, and it's just wonderful for me personally to see it develop and for it to come through. So yeah, so that's my story about what I did during the pandemic, but there was a lot going on, trust me. And I'm going to tell you about some of it. So it wasn't all about working on the vaccines. As I mentioned, there's 155 different projects. So some of them were non-vaccine projects. And one area was in detection and monitoring. And we're working with commercial partners like Sensign Health, who developed a blood pressure monitor, and Oxy Health, which is one of our spin-outs. They developed monitoring technologies that came out of the engineering department, and this is how the spin-out was created. And so they were able to monitor the pulse and breathing rates and vital signs of patients, really important when we can't, if you're not entering the room with a patient, or it allows you to not enter the room with a patient. The other one here is OXED. It's our researchers in university and the Oscar Center that we have in China. I know that a lot of people are interested in what our work in China. With their local researchers, we developed a rapid testing kit for COVID. They created this is a social enterprise, and the team worked with Pronetics, a Hong Kong-based company who were looking to expand their testing ability, and they were eventually acquired by them, resulting in one of the shortest innovation to exits within the university. So really interesting. So the OXED test allows you to get a result in under 30 minutes and is a low-cost COVID test kit. It's been approved by the MHRA and has a CE mark for Europe. So they are also now, under the terms of the agreement that they've got with Pronetics, they're sort of developing it for low to middle income countries across the globe. So it's really an interesting progression of the research. Another achievement is the Q-COVID, a risk calculator that rolled out across the UK at the start of 2021. It's proven essential for GPs in identifying patients at most risk or with severe complications from COVID, which allows them to provide guidance on shielding. And then we've got Oxford Nanopore, which they were at the beginning of the pandemic. They decided to change their focus to do rapid testing of COVID-19. And this, they sort of broaden their work in this application technology, and so they're allowing them to identify new variants in the COVID detection. Oxvent is the last one here. Like OXED, it's a social enterprise. It was created as part of at the start of the crisis, actually. And it was formed to manufacture low-cost, no-frills ventilators to meet the NHS demand. The NHS was ultimately able to meet the demand for ventilators in the UK. However, Oxvent is now aiming to make their technology available to low-income countries where the pandemic is still raging. So other outcomes from the so much has happened, to be honest, and we've got I've tried to choose the interesting ones. So there's this program called Legacy that's just got 149 million from the Chan Zuckerberg initiative to investigate how ancestry and diversity influence how vaccines work in our cells. So the program's vision is to understand and ultimately to predict how humans respond to vaccines at a single cell level. The project has the potential to significantly advance understanding of how vaccines stimulate immunity across ethnicities and provide new insights for future efforts in vaccine design. This is important given that COVID-19, the pandemic, demonstrated how emerging infections can disproportionately affect different ethnic populations. Combating global infection threats to human health also requires vaccine development at an unprecedented speed, as exemplified by the groundbreaking COVID-19 research generated in the university. So there's leading, we have also just on the 5th of November launched something called the Q-Pharma program. It's with our leading academics in Oxford as part of a consortium that received 6.8 million from the Industrial Strategy Challenge funding. So it's quantum computing and drug discovery, basically. And this is, it's a very exciting area, and we put a lot of effort into it this year based on our understanding of how we can accelerate research to get to a certain point. And our Pro Vice Chancellor for Innovation, Professor Chaz Bountra, is the lead academic on this. And his quote is that we in academia need to do everything possible to help our industry colleagues accelerate the development of new medicines for patients. And I'm immensely proud of this project. It's an opportunity for us to work with so many technology leaders and potentially transform the process of drug discovery. We must make it better, faster and cheaper, something I have heard in this the drug discovery process and in this sector for a long time. So the partnership will accelerate the use of quantum computing. One of our partners actually is the Medicines Discovery Catapult, so Clive might know about that. And then there's one other thing that's come out of here that is called the GPAS. It's a Global Pathogen Analysis System. It's basically a cloud-based secure solution for standardized processing of pathogen genomic sequence data. The aim is to build a large network of global users that can benefit from solutions starting with SARS-CoV-2. And once it's up and running, the data will be shared and stored in global surveillance databases, enabling faster, more accurate, standardized and resilient data about emergent variants and transmission events, helping policymakers and public health agencies respond to the current and future pandemics.
Deborah, can we just, this is all really, really interesting stuff. Do you think we can just terminate it there so we can take some Q&A and then we'll have to finish if we have some time after that? Is that all right?
Yeah,
but thank you very much for your contribution. It's been very interesting.
Okay, no worries. I'll just.
Thank you. I can't see any questions in the chat yet, but who would like to start with the first question? I don't know whether you can see anything in the Q&A yet, Orla.
No, there's not any questions yet.
Oh, okay, I think there's one from Helen. Thank you, Helen. Would you like to go ahead? And introduce yourself as well, if you could, to the life sciences audience.
Helen, Innovation Management Research at Birkbeck. It's very interesting having these three different perspectives, starting with Clive, and it was seriously worrying what you were saying about how many advances we made, and then we've gone back again, and then the more upbeat messages from Alex and Deborah. I don't know how you feel about that, but during the pandemic, we were all wondering what the Americans were doing. We were talking about what was going on in Europe. And what's your view now, Clive, about where we sit in respect to America? Because America's always been heralded as the centre of gravity for bioscience. And it looks as though we overtook them for a while.
I think of course, America always has more funding, much bigger funds, and even the government funds like BARDA and the like were there, and they were already funding lots of research and background work on pandemic preparedness anyway, and they were already linked in. And they obviously set up a task force like we did and extracted from that funding stuff and moved it on. But their task force was called Warp Speed, didn't actually go at warp speed. It got very bureaucratic. And I think we showed them that there was another way of doing things, which was pulling together people in government that were good at making decisions with people from industry that knew how to make decisions around science, and do things a lot faster. I mean, don't get me wrong. I wasn't negative about what we did, but we did it very differently to how we do things before, and I think it's slipping back to going back to where it was. I don't see what we've got to do as a life science sector, particularly now with the new life science strategy, is we've got to energise that in the way we were energised to do the work early on. I'm not 100% convinced we've got that right. I think it's all gone very, very slow again and gone back to lots of discussions and lots of committees and stuff like that. But in terms of America, I think they they have all the wherewithal. They've always got the power in terms of numbers and funding, but they did go quite bureaucratic when it came to the buying of the vaccines and the rollout, and they had lots of to and fro between the FDA and the warp speed that wasn't very pleasant, actually.
I mean, it's one of those examples of having extreme resources but terrible execution. I mean, they had all the money in the world. I mean, so if looking at testing, because that's the area that we've been in, I mean, 2 months ago, you literally couldn't buy COVID tests on shelves because all the manufacturers had stopped making them over the summer. You know, it's just wild things where they basically threw enormous amounts of money at it. But their regulatory policy didn't map to what federal government wanted, which meant that FDA actually actively prevented a lot of different technologies getting in quickly, limited choice, limited accessibility. But then because they weren't being procured that much directly by federal government, it also meant you didn't have supply either. So you didn't have optionality or supply. And they've, honestly, it's a complete disaster. I mean, from a healthcare, public health policy perspective, yeah. But in terms of technologies, there's obviously been some brilliant work over there. They did a lot better than us with regard to sourcing supply of things, but that's because they have a little bit more manufacturing than we do direct. But yeah, I think from a healthcare policy perspective, disaster, and that's why it's still a problem.
Deborah, you were nodding as well. Do you have some comments to make there?
Yeah, I was going to say that we were talking about the manufacturing, that there's been a huge chunk of investment. I think the BIA announced recently that there was quite a lot. There's 255 million investment in manufacturing. And I'm assuming that this is all part of the learning that the government had from the pandemic, and we need the whole message is being better prepared and onshoring, as Alex was saying as well, which I think we do need to keep that. And I think what Clive is saying about keeping that momentum going as well is really true, because we kind of clock that too, that we need to keep these things going, keep it in the memories of everyone that we were able to accelerate the process, and it is possible to do it and not to go back to our old ways. And people are, I know that academics are trying to keep that in mind. In fact, it's when we have new issues globally. Right now, it's about climate change. So I work right across all the sectors because I look after the industrial strategy. So it's all the grand challenges right now, clean tech. And so there's a lot of interest in the global climate change issues. And so there's a focus on that. Can we do what we did in the pandemic for climate change? Those are the kind of questions in academia.
That's a very good point. Thank you. I think we have a question from Grazia in the audience. Can you say where you're from, Grazia, and ask your question? Are you on mute? Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. I'm Grazia. I'm a retired academic and I'm a fellow of the center at Birkbeck. Thank you very much to both speakers. So far, the discussion has brought in various perspectives: the perspective of academia, the perspective of the private sector, and the perspective of nation states, US versus UK, and so on. Now, one thing I want to ask, in particular Deborah, but also Alex, is the following. I think, Deborah, you are sort of in charge of trying to forge a partnership between academia and the private sector. To what extent, if at all, do you think that this renders more difficult a collaboration between academics from different countries? Because in a way, does actually the collaboration with industry help or hinders the exchanges between academics across countries? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll just take that. Yes, question has come up within our partnership, our innovation and business partnership team in particular. We're very sort of driven by politics as well, what's going on. And so can we speak to people in China today or not? And so that has been a problem, and we do need to always check on these things too. But you know, the whole idea of science has no, you know, it has no borders. We do have that in our minds, and we have academics who always want to, who have partners in the US, in Europe, or in Asia. They want to work with them. They know them, and they want to engage with them on various projects. And if you're going for funding that's in the UK, it's quite restrictive now. I was very involved in that quantum drug discovery program, and one of the things that we were looking at was, do we ask a UK pharmaceutical company to join that program, or are we open to just speaking to others across the world? And we did actually involve Merck in this, but you know, they're going to be a user, and so that's our pharma company, just to give you a real example of how difficult it is sometimes for us in academia.
I think just quickly on that point, I think there's some, I think maybe slightly controversial opinion, but I would say actually that I think tech companies have really transformed the ways that which we kind of even view where like academic research is coming from. You've seen a company like DeepMind actually do some really incredible research, and actually not have, you know, in that sense, it's not part of the university in that respect. I actually think, you know, a lot of the incentivization around, you know, on the academic side is often around, you know, publication. It's about credibility, building that kind of space, whereas companies are really focused on kind of trying to solve solutions. I think it's really important to kind of bridge that gap together. Whether that's now stronger post-pandemic or not, I don't know. Certainly connectivity completely changes the game there. But I think also we would need to see, you know, kind of really looking at what kinds of funding opportunities there are to kind of link these different bodies together. But I think certainly from, say, an industry perspective, I mean, key is kind of speed and kind of execution capability. And I think, you know, as I say, sometimes you often see like the bureaucracy of particularly large companies and academic institutions can actually slow that down a little bit. I think and we haven't seen that in a lot of the way that the projects have run in the pandemic. And I think it's about trying to, well, what can we learn from that in terms of, you know, executional capabilities between multifaceted large organizations to kind of retain pace. But I think we'll see.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. That's great. Thanks for your question, Grazia. Helen's made the comment that the UK did very well in having Kate Bingham in place. You know, the agency of key players was really important in getting things done. If I could ask the panel a question, we've talked quite a lot about the importance of speed and everybody working together in a different way during the pandemic. If a government policy isn't the way to sort of bake these things into institutional and national memory, what's the way to keep the momentum going? What do you each suggest? Alex, what do you think? How do we bake in those things we learned during the pandemic?
I think one thing would be particularly around sort of sources of funds and also regulatory flexibility and outreach. I mean, you know, we've seen that during the pandemic, actually transforming the ways in which kind of regulators operated and thought about the different concepts has actually allowed a lot of technologies to move way faster than they would ever before. And so I think that type of engagement is incredibly important. We're actually seeing in Europe almost the opposite. We're actually seeing the portcullis being, you know, really kind of drawn up to actually make it harder for certainly healthcare innovation to go forward and reach the market, and those really kind of quite you know, challenging standards, especially for small companies, also being applied to software as well. Important, of course, to maintain safety, but also I think we need to see more of that kind of engagement and flexibility to ensure that, you know, the best technology can get there. Funding's the key. That's where a lot of the big gaps are, because actually we have incredible infrastructure at the small scale, and then as you start to look up, the number of allies you could draw upon starts to become really quite thin. And I think that's an area for really significant investment. We need funds that are looking at, okay, where are the next $1 billion life science companies coming from in the UK? Those are the ones that are going to really transform the economy. How do we stop them from all just moving to the US? Because arguably, say in medical devices, 50% of the market is in the US and all the scale up money is there. What's to stop companies from flipping over and becoming US entities at the point in their journey when they can no longer access the type of funding they need? How can we make sure that they stay in the UK? That's also one, it's about knowledge and all of that, but it's also about access to capital. And two, I'd say, why be in the UK? The UK has brilliant like R&D capabilities, great talent. And three, I think the thing I said to you before I joined this was,
actually suddenly we've just trained the entire population in how to use a medical device for an acute disease at home. This is a crazy opportunity to look at ways in which we actually fundamentally change the model with which we deliver healthcare, and we need to jump on that, because I know we're saying the climate crisis is urgent. The healthcare crisis that we're staring at right now is in some ways no less urgent. I was talking the other day with Google Health, and they know apparently the Japanese government is going to go bankrupt in 20 years' time because they can't afford to care for people. There's really high proportion elderly population, multiple comorbidities. Just look at where life expectancy went in the north of England, during COVID. That's not because of COVID. That's actually because health in this country is so poor and unequal. That's really what we need to be looking at, because it's okay, we might get a healthy planet, but it's not great if everyone on it is unhealthy. So that's my piece. Good.
Now, Clive, just some comments from you, please, on how we're going to bake in these new ideas of thinking. Because I know when we discussed prior to this debate, you made reference to a pandemic preparedness document that had been prepared 10 or so years ago, which might have been very useful, but nobody knew where it was when a real pandemic came along. Well,
there is baking in what we used to call in industry corporate memory, but baking in the memory of what we've done so that it's accessible in some way. And I think with today's sort of internet-based approach to be able to access things, there should be a storybook that can be accessed and people can see it. And I think that's really important. But I think what we need to bake in is the attitudes that were there at the beginning. And it's attitudes that are really, really important. So, we've got a life science industrial strategy. It's amazingly complex. It's far-reaching and very ambitious. But what's going to stop it becoming the thing that attracts the funding, which is always the perennial issue, is the funding. What's going to attract the private funding is that the government puts money where its mouth is to fund the things that the strategy can do as a foundation. And what the issue there is all about attitude, though. So what we've got is, we've got three groupings, really. We've got the industry, big and small. We've got academia, and we've got government. All three have to play a role in getting that foundation for the country right, and then the funding will flow. And what we have at the moment is, we have a deep level of suspicion from academics and from government of what industry's motives are. But industry has always had one motive, which is not to make money. The pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare industry, its main priority is to find things that do good. It so happens when you do that, you make a lot of money. But the academic side of the equation and the government side are deeply suspicious of the industrial side, and that's got to go. It's got to become a group of people that are working together and look at each other in the eye and trust each other. And until you do that and then get the funding flowing into that system, it's never going to work. So, and the UK is the one place that seems to be worse than anywhere for that suspicion. The US, they all work together, and we say, oh, there isn't enough funding here. That's because we haven't got those groups really joined up working together. And they did work together during the start of the pandemic. All of them had a common enemy, and it wasn't each other, it was somebody else, and they made it work. Thank you, that's great. Deborah, final point from you on that. I'm taking
so you're running out of time.
No, especially in a big organisation, even like the University of Oxford, it must be hard enough to keep things going within that.
Yeah, we've got some great innovation leaders as well that are trying to keep that going, which is really good. But I think I agree with everything that they're saying. So I'm only going to add one other thing that I think that will help keep things going. And besides, the key people that were involved in a lot of the exciting things during the pandemic to get to the vaccine, get the vaccine rolled out to the world. Skills development, I think that's really something from a business development point of view. I've been hearing from some of our partners, our industry partners, that they're seeing a skills issue, and I don't know if Alex, you are seeing that, and Clive, you both are in companies, but that is something that I've been made aware of, and I'm very keen to ensure that we don't lose people to the US, for example, where there's a lot more money. And coming to that, I've just seen the Oxford University Innovation talk about their spin-outs, and they're saying yes, we did fund a lot. We've got a lot of investment in some of the companies, but there's still a gap in the difference between the US and the UK and what we're doing. So there's still that issue too. So we need to ensure that our environment is conducive to keep going with this. And then what Clive had said about behaviours and attitudes, I think is really important too. It's kind of a double thing. But I'm just going to leave. One other thing I wanted to say is that with policy, it's really been interesting to see that, like the Newton Fund, and because of overseas aid has been cut, these sort of pockets of funding have made it difficult for us to do research for the lower middle income countries that we a lot of our academics work with. It's just suddenly cut. So that's something I think that needs to maybe be looked at and rejiggered, because yeah, it shouldn't prevent us doing things like brilliant work with the Newton Fund and things like that, which there's an issue. Anyway, I've said my bit as well. So thanks. That's great.
Much. Thank you very much. Thank you. And just to note a comment from Richard Rideout in the chat, who talks about the importance of incubators and science parks, etc. So a good point there. Science parks, something close to my own heart, if any of you recall my comments from the beginning. Well, thank you very much. I think that brings our debate to a close. I think we have raised some really, really interesting points. I don't think we have necessarily answered them all, but we've made some really, really interesting points, and I think things that are going to be debated for a long time hence in public policy and in life sciences. So I'd like to close by thanking my speakers, Clive Dix, Alex Sheppard and Deborah Spencer,